What it was like to be sick 1,000 years ago. History to Unwind. Hey, before we begin, if you find yourself drifting off to this one, that means we're doing something right. Take a moment to like the video if you enjoy this kind of calm historical storytelling, and subscribe if you want more, only if it genuinely resonates with you. And drop a comment letting us know what you heard about this video. A friend, a recommendation, a late night rabbit hole. We love knowing how you found your way here. Now, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's go back, a long way back. Imagine waking up 1,000 years ago with a fever. Not the gentle, modern kind of fever where you reach for a thermometer and a box of paracetamol, call in sick to work, and spend the day on the couch watching something comforting. No. Imagine waking up in the year 1025, deep inside a stone house or a longhouse built from timber and thatch. The walls exhaling the cold of a northern winter, the only warmth coming from a fire that burned through the night in the center of the room. The smoke curling upward, finding its way out through a hole in the roof, or not quite making it, hanging instead in the air above you like a low gray ceiling. You wake with a burning behind your eyes. Your skin is dry and hot to the touch. Your throat feels like it has been lined with sand. Around you, the sounds of your family beginning their morning, a child stirring, someone stoking the fire back to life, the distant sound of animals outside in the cold. And in the faint glow of the first light, your mother or your wife or your daughter comes to you, presses a hand to your forehead, and her face does something it tries not to do. It tightens, just a little. Because she has seen this before. She knows what a fever in winter can become. There are no hospitals within reach. There are no antibiotics, no saline drips, no sterile instruments waiting in a drawer. There is no one you can call. No emergency service that will arrive in minutes. There is, instead, a world of knowledge that is older than any book in your village, passed down through hands and whispers and observation, through generations of people who have watched the sick and tried, in every way available to them, to bring them back. And here is the thing that surprises most people when they think carefully about this moment. Medieval people were not as helpless as we often imagine. They had systems, they had healers, they had theories, remedies, and prayers. They had each other. What they lacked was the germ theory of disease. That one shift in human understanding that would, centuries later, change everything. But in the year 1025, they didn't know what they were missing. They only knew what they had. And what they had was, in its own strange and sometimes effective way, a great deal. Let's begin where they began, with the question that would have been the very first thing a medieval healer asked when confronted with a sick person. Not, what is wrong with you, in the modern sense, but rather, what is out of balance inside you? The theory that governed medicine across almost the entire medieval world, from the stone monasteries of Ireland to the universities of Bologna, from the households of English peasants to the consulting rooms of physicians in Paris, was called humoral theory. And it was old, staggeringly old. It had been developed by the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, and later elaborated by the Roman physician Galen, whose writings would remain the authoritative text of Western medicine for more than 1,000 years after his death. Avicenna, the brilliant Persian polymath writing around the year 1000, built upon this tradition and expanded it into what became the Islamic world's foundational medical text, the Canon of Medicine. A work so comprehensive, it was still being taught in European universities as late as the 1600s. The theory held that the human body contained 4 vital fluids, called humors: blood, which was warm and moist, associated with the element of air in the season of spring; phlegm, which was cold and moist, linked to water into winter, which is why, if you think about it, we still use the word phlegmatic to describe a calm, slow-moving person. Yellow bile, hot and dry, fire-like, associated with summer and with the hot-tempered, irritable personality we still call choleric. And finally, black bile, cold and dry, earthy and heavy. The humor connected to autumn and to the kind of deep, slow sadness we still call melancholy. A word that literally translates from the Greek as black bile. Health, in this framework, was not the absence of disease. Health was balance. When your four humors existed in their proper proportions, you felt well. You were energetic, clear-headed, warm without being feverish, digesting without disturbance. But the moment one humor tipped too far, when blood became excessive, when yellow bile raged out of control, when phlegm accumulated in the chest and throat, that imbalance produced the symptoms we would recognize as illness. A fever was not, in the medieval mind, a sign that your body was fighting an infection. It was a sign that your blood was running too hot, that the fiery qualities inside you had overwhelmed the cooler ones, that balance had been disrupted and needed urgently to be restored. This framework shaped everything. It shaped how people ate. Certain foods were considered hot and dry, others cold and wet. And a skilled physician would prescribe your diet the way a modern doctor might prescribe medication, based on what your particular imbalance seemed to demand. It shaped when you were bled, since the timing of bloodletting was calculated according to the position of the moon and planets, which were believed to exert direct influence over the fluids of the body. It shaped which herbs were administered, since every plant was understood to have its own humoral character, warming or cooling, drying or moistening, and the art of the healer was to match the herb to the imbalance. But humoral theory was only one piece of the medieval understanding of disease. Alongside it ran several other explanations, not always in harmony with each other, coexisting the way belief systems often do, each of them offering comfort of a different kind. There was the miasma theory. The word comes from the Greek for pollution or contamination, and the idea was exactly what it sounds like, that disease arose from bad air, rotting matter, stagnant water, decaying animals, swamps in summer heat. These were believed to release corrupted vapors into the atmosphere, and breathing those vapors was understood to cause illness. This is why medieval cities tried, sometimes effectively, to manage their waste. This is why people burned aromatic woods and herbs during epidemics, filling the air with smoke that they hoped would counteract the corrupt vapors. This is why physicians during plague outbreaks carried those famous beaked masks, filled not as decoration but as primitive filters, stuffed with herbs and spices intended to cleanse the air before it reached the lungs. The miasma theory was wrong about mechanism, but right about observation. Disease does cluster around filth and stagnant water, even if not for the reasons they believed. Then there was the deeply religious explanation. In a world where Christianity saturated every aspect of daily life, sickness was frequently understood as a message from God, not a punishment in the simple, crude sense. Medieval theology was far more nuanced than that, but a visitation, a trial, an opportunity for spiritual examination. The sick person was understood to be in a liminal state, positioned between the ordinary world and something larger. Their illness invited reflection, confession, and prayer. It was not uncommon for a physician to refuse to treat a patient who had not first confessed their sins, not out of cruelty, but out of genuine belief that the spiritual and the physical were so thoroughly intertwined that treating the body without attending to the soul was simply incomplete medicine. Astrology played a role that is difficult for modern minds to fully take seriously, but which was entirely integrated into medical practice at the highest levels. The belief that the planets govern the humors, that Saturn influenced black bile, that the moon governed phlegm and all bodily fluids, that Mars stirred yellow bile towards its most volatile extremes, meant that a physician consulting a patient would often want to know not just what symptoms were present, but what day it was, what phase the moon was in, what signs the planets occupied. Astrological calendars called almanacs were medical tools. Physicians carried charts showing which days were favorable for bleeding, which were dangerous for surgery, which were ideal for beginning a treatment of any kind. The body was understood as a microcosm, a small version of the universe, and the movements of the cosmos were believed to ripple through it constantly. And beneath all of this, sometimes woven into it, sometimes running parallel, were older beliefs about spirits and magic. The idea that illness could be caused by malicious supernatural forces, a curse, an ill wish, the intervention of a demon, never entirely disappeared from the medieval world. In the countryside especially, away from the universities and the formal structures of church medicine, the sick person might be understood as afflicted by something that required not just physical treatment, but spiritual confrontation. Charms were recited, protective objects were placed near the sickbed, certain words were spoken over wounds to encourage healing. These practices coexisted alongside the learned medicine of the physicians, and they were not entirely separate from it. Even university-trained doctors believed in the power of prayer and the saints. So into this layered world of explanation and belief, imagine now the arrival of a physician, not just anyone. A university-trained medical doctor, the highest level of learned healer in the medieval world, and already by the year 1025, a figure shaped by a remarkably sophisticated educational tradition. The medical school at Salerno in southern Italy had been operating since at least the 9th century and would become, through the 11th century, the most important center of medical learning in Europe. It drew on Greek, Roman, and Arabic sources simultaneously, translating and synthesizing the great medical texts, and producing graduates who understood humoral theory, pharmacology, diagnosis, and prognosis in considerable depth. Bologna followed, Paris followed. By the 12th century, university medicine was a real, structured, demanding discipline. But here is the thing about university physicians. Almost nobody in the medieval world ever saw one. These doctors were expensive. They practiced in cities. A consultation with a physician in Paris or Bologna or London cost more than most people in England or France or Germany earned in a week. The wealthy could afford them. Nobles could send for them. Kings retained them on permanent salary. But the vast majority of the medieval population, the farmers, the craftspeople, the laborers, the villagers who made up perhaps 90% of all people alive, lived their entire lives without ever sitting across a table from a university-trained physician. What such a physician would have done had you been wealthy enough to afford one is something worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is stranger and more fascinating than we usually imagine. He would have arrived at your bedside wearing long robes that announced his education. He would have asked detailed questions, not just about your symptoms, but about your recent diet, your emotional state, the quality of your sleep, the season, the region you lived in, your temperament. Was your complexion naturally ruddy or pale? Did you tend toward the sanguine or the melancholic? He would have felt your pulse, comparing its rhythm and strength against an elaborate taxonomy of pulse types inherited from Galen, each of which corresponded to different humoral conditions. And then he would have taken your urine, not in the modern sense of a clinical test. He would have held it up to the light in a glass flask called a matula, a vessel specifically designed for this purpose, shaped to concentrate the liquid at the bottom for examination. He would have noted its color, comparing it against a printed chart called a urine wheel that showed 20 distinct shades, from nearly transparent to deep dark brown, each associated with different humoral imbalances and different prognoses. He would have noted the clarity or cloudiness of the sample, the presence of sediment, the smell, and in some traditions documented in medical texts, even the taste. Uroscopy, the art of reading urine, was considered one of the most important diagnostic skills in the medieval physician's toolkit, and it was practiced with complete seriousness at the highest levels of medical learning. Based on all of this information, the physician would construct a diagnosis and a treatment plan. The treatment plan almost certainly involved dietary adjustments. It might involve specific herbal preparations, and very likely, it would involve bloodletting. Which brings us to the single most common medical procedure in the entire medieval world, performed by physicians and non-physicians alike, across every social class, for virtually every illness known. But before we get to the blood, we need to understand who was actually doing most of the medical work in the medieval world. Because while the university physician was a figure of great prestige, his reach was limited. The person you were far more likely to encounter when you needed physical intervention, when a tooth was screaming in your jaw, when you had a wound that needed cleaning and closing, when the physician had prescribed a bloodletting and someone needed to actually do it, was the barber-surgeon. The barber-surgeon is one of the strangest figures in the history of medicine, and one of the most important. The first barber-surgeons to be formally recognized as such appeared around 1000 AD, emerging from the monasteries of Europe, where barbers had been employed to maintain the monks' tonsures, the shaved circles on the top of their heads required by religious custom. Because the barbers were already there, already skilled with blades, already trusted with a kind of intimate care, they began to take on more tasks. The monks performed bloodletting as part of their own health maintenance, and when a papal decree in the 12th century forbade clergy from shedding blood, the barbers absorbed that function too. And then more functions followed, and more after that. By the high medieval period, the barber-surgeon was offering a remarkable range of services from a single shop, a combination that would make your head spin if you encountered it today. He cut hair, he shaved beards, he pulled teeth, using forceps and his body weight, bracing himself against the patient, while the patient sat in a chair and gripped the armrests, and prayed. He applied leeches, he opened veins for bloodletting, he cleaned and dressed wounds, he set broken bones with splints, he lanced abscesses, he performed amputations. He removed bladder stones, a uniquely agonizing procedure carried out on fully conscious patients. And outside his shop, a red and white striped pole announced his presence, the white representing the bandages, the red, the blood. A sign that meant healing was available here for those who could afford it, and those brave enough to enter. The barber-surgeon was considered socially inferior to the university physician, and the distinction was clear in their respective robes. Physicians wore long ones, barber-surgeons wore shorter ones, a difference in fabric that reflected a difference in status that separated the learned from the merely skilled. Physicians learned from books. Barber-surgeons learned from doing, through apprenticeships that began in adolescence, watching and assisting before eventually taking over. And here is the historical irony that deserves emphasis. In many practical situations, the barber-surgeon was considerably more effective than the physician. He dealt with the real world of blood and bone. He developed genuine technical skill through sheer repetition. When it came to a wound in the field, a limb that needed to come off before gangrene spread further, or a tooth causing a jaw infection that could kill, the barber-surgeon was often your best hope. Now, let us talk about blood, because the treatment that connected the physician's theory to the barber-surgeon's practice more than any other was bloodletting, and its prevalence in the medieval world was extraordinary. This was not a fringe practice, not something reserved for desperate cases. It was the standard of care. It was the first line of treatment. If you were sick in medieval Europe, the assumption was that blood, or one of the other humors, was out of balance, and the most direct way to correct that imbalance was to remove some of the offending substance. The procedure came in two main forms. Phlebotomy involved opening a vein, usually at the inner elbow or the back of the knee, with a lancet, a small, sharp blade specifically designed for this purpose, and allowing blood to flow into a bowl until the physician or barber-surgeon judged that enough had been removed. The amount taken was calibrated. A strong man might lose the amount that a thirsty person could swallow in one gulp, while a frailer patient would lose less. Hildegard of Bingen, the brilliant 12th century abbess and medical writer, even specified precise volumes. From a strong man, take the amount that fills a moderate-sized egg. Afterward, the patient was to rest for 3 days and drink undiluted wine, because wine, she wrote, is the blood of the earth. The second form involved leeches, the aquatic worms that attach themselves to skin and feed on blood. Medicinal leeches, Hirudo medicinalis, the species native to European freshwater, were so widely used through the medieval period and beyond that by the 19th century they had been nearly driven to extinction in parts of Europe, collected in such quantities for medical use that their natural populations couldn't recover. Leeches were applied to specific parts of the body corresponding to the site of the illness. Near a headache, near a swollen joint, near an infected eye. They were gentler than the lancet in the sense that they self-regulated somewhat, detaching once they were full, though practitioners sometimes applied salt or vinegar to encourage them to release early. Timing mattered enormously. bloodletting was governed by the position of the moon in the astrological calendar, and specialized almanacs called bleeding charts showed, month by month, which days were propitious for the procedure and which were dangerous. Each region of the body was governed by a different zodiac sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck and throat, Gemini the arms and shoulders, down through the body to Pisces, which governed the feet. And the ideal time to bleed from a particular location was when the moon was not occupying the sign that governed that region. Physicians needed to know astronomy. Medical and astronomical knowledge were not separate disciplines. They were one. Did bloodletting work? Occasionally, in narrow circumstances, it may have had some benefit, reducing blood pressure perhaps in cases of dangerously high fever or certain types of stroke. But in most cases, it was neutral at best and actively harmful at worst, weakening patients who are already struggling, reducing their ability to fight infection at precisely the moment when their immune systems needed every resource available. The tragedy is that the theory made complete logical sense given what people knew about the body. The problem was not ignorance. The problem was that they were working from the wrong map. Alongside bloodletting, and sometimes far more effective than it, was the extraordinary tradition of herbal medicine that ran through every level of medieval society. This was not crude guesswork. It was an accumulated body of knowledge built over centuries, written down in manuscripts called herbals, maintained in the carefully tended gardens of monasteries, and carried in the minds and hands of healers, especially women, who had spent lifetimes learning which plants did what. Willow bark was used to reduce fever and ease pain. We know now that it contains salicylic acid, the active compound from which aspirin was synthesized in the 19th century. They didn't know the chemistry. They knew the effect. Garlic was used for infections and digestive complaints, and a famous medieval eye salve made from garlic, leeks, wine, and ox bile was recently tested by microbiologists at the University of Nottingham, who found it to be 90% effective against MRSA, the antibiotic-resistant bacterial strain that causes serious problems in modern hospitals. Again, they didn't know why it worked. They knew that it worked. Sage, whose Latin name salvia comes from the verb meaning I am well, was described in medieval sources as fresh and green to cleanse the body of venom and pestilence. Modern research confirms it has antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Chamomile was used for headaches, fever, and to settle the stomach. It remains in use for exactly these purposes today. Comfrey was applied to broken bones and sprains. Its common name was once knitbone, a description of its believed effect on healing tissue. Lavender was used in baths and washes for headaches, and multiple studies have shown its essential oil is genuinely effective against certain bacterial and fungal infections. A 10th century English herbal called the Lacnunga, a collection of remedies blending Christian prayers, herbal prescriptions, and charms against illness, gives us a vivid window into the layered complexity of this medicine. It praises 9 sacred herbs including chamomile, plantain, fennel, and nettle. It instructs the healer to pound them, mix them, recite specific words over the preparation. The herbs were real and often effective. The words were the spiritual component, the intention made audible. A practice that would have seemed entirely natural in a world where the physical and the divine were not yet separated into different categories of truth. The monasteries were the great pharmaceutical laboratories of the medieval world. Benedictine abbeys maintained elaborate herb gardens following guidelines set out by Saint Benedict himself in the 6th century, growing sage, rosemary, mint, thyme, and dozens of other medicinal plants. Monks and nuns who worked in infirmaries developed real clinical experience over years of caring for the sick, both members of their own communities and the lay people who came seeking help. Hildegard of Bingen, writing in the 12th century, produced 2 major medical works, Physica and Causae et Curae, that detailed hundreds of plants, animals, and minerals and their medical uses with a precision and specificity that goes far beyond anything that could be called mere superstition. She was a scientist in every sense that the word could meaningfully apply to her time. Women were central to medieval healing at every level below the university. In villages across Europe, the wise woman, sometimes called a cunning woman, sometimes a midwife, sometimes simply the woman who knew about plants, was the first person consulted when someone fell ill. She maintained her own herb garden or knew where to find what she needed in the hedgerows and fields. She brewed tisanes and poultices and ointments. She assisted at childbirths and laid out the dead. She was the backbone of everyday medical care for the majority of the population, and her knowledge, passed between women across generations, was both deeper and more practical than is often credited. The first formal hospitals in Europe were not medical institutions in the modern sense. This is worth understanding clearly. When we use the word hospital today, we mean a place where sick people go to be diagnosed and treated with the goal of cure. The medieval hospital had a different purpose, or more precisely, a different primary purpose. It was a place of hospitality. The word itself comes from the Latin hospes, meaning guest, where the poor, the elderly, the pilgrim, and the sick could find shelter, food, warmth, prayer, and basic care. The goal was not necessarily cure. The goal was comfort, dignity, and the preparation of the soul for whatever came next. Medieval hospitals were overwhelmingly religious institutions, founded by the church or by wealthy patrons in acts of charity that were understood as investments in their own spiritual welfare. To feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, and care for the sick was to perform the acts of mercy described in the Gospel of Matthew. And the person who founded a hospital was ensuring that such acts would be performed in their name, generating spiritual benefit for their soul. The Hospital of Santa Maria della Nuova in Florence, founded in 1288, became one of the most sophisticated medical institutions in Europe, eventually developing what looked like proto-clinical practices, keeping records of patients and their conditions, separating men from women, arranging beds so that every patient could see the altar. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded much earlier, in the 7th century, was one of the oldest continuously operating hospitals in the world. The care inside these hospitals was provided by religious orders, monks, nuns, friars, who understood their nursing as a form of prayer. Patients received food, including meat and wine that the nursing staff themselves were forbidden to eat, because the sick body was understood to require what the healthy body could forego. They received herbal preparations, wound care, and prayers said over them individually. In some hospitals, patients were required to make confession before they could be admitted, not as a gatekeeping measure, but as an acknowledgement that physical and spiritual health could not truly be separated. What happened when you got seriously sick, though? When fever didn't pass in a day, but stretched into 3, 5, 7 days, when breathing became labored, when infection set in, was a more intimate story than anything a hospital tells. For the vast majority of people, serious illness unfolded at home. The family became the hospital. The mother or wife became the nurse. The healer of the village came to consult. The priest came to offer last rites if things looked grave, not as a death sentence, but as spiritual care offered while there was still time for the sacrament to be received. The repertoire available to a family nursing a seriously ill person at home was wider than we might expect. Warm broth was made and pressed on the patient repeatedly. Beef or chicken broth whose nutritional value and hydration benefits were understood through observation, if not through biochemistry. Poultices were prepared from heated herbs and applied to the chest to ease the congestion of pneumonia. Compresses of cool water were placed on the forehead when fever spiked. Honey, which has genuine antimicrobial properties that were empirically observed without being scientifically explained, was used on wounds and in preparations for respiratory illness. Onion and garlic, both demonstrably effective against certain bacterial infections, were used liberally in preparations for infection and chest complaints. The smoke of certain burning herbs was directed toward the sick person in a form of fumigation intended to cleanse the air around them. The patient was kept warm. This sounds obvious, but in a stone house in a northern winter with no central heating, keeping a feverish person warm enough was a real challenge that required sustained attention and the cooperation of the whole household. The fire was kept burning through the night. Someone sat with the patient. Sleep for the caregiver came in fragments. It is worth pausing here to note what the research on medieval skeletons tells us about the body's resilience. Archaeologists examining medieval burial sites have found abundant evidence of broken bones that healed cleanly, of serious injuries survived, of the kind of physical trauma that suggests a body with a formidable immune system maintained by a physical life, and sometimes surprising medical attention. Many bones show evidence of healing that required some form of care: splinting, immobilization, rest. The people who set those bones knew what they were doing, even without x-rays to guide them. The epidemics that swept through medieval Europe, though, were a different category of suffering entirely. They were the moments when everything that medicine, prayer, community, and individual resilience could offer was overwhelmed by forces that simply could not be addressed within the understanding available to the time. Smallpox was endemic through much of the medieval period, cycling through populations and leaving a landscape of pockmarked faces and occasional blindness as its visible legacy among survivors. Children who survived their first exposure developed immunity, but those who had never encountered it, and this was most acutely true of the populations encountered by European explorers centuries later, could be devastated. Dysentery, the bloody flux, killed through dehydration, and, in a time without intravenous fluids to replace what was lost, it killed efficiently and without discrimination. Tuberculosis, which medieval people called consumption for the way it seemed to consume the body from within, was a slow and pitiless disease that killed gradually, drawing down the strength of the afflicted across months and years, often in young people in their prime. Ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus called Claviceps purpurea that grows on rye grain in damp conditions, producing compounds chemically related to LSD, was a recurring cause of epidemic illness in the medieval period. The afflicted would experience burning sensations in their limbs, hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, the constriction of blood vessels that caused limbs to turn black and eventually fall off, a condition known as St. Anthony's Fire, named for the monastery where sufferers sought help. Entire communities could be affected when a grain harvest went bad, and the cause would not be identified for centuries. And then there was the Black Death. The bubonic plague arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population of the continent within a few years. It deserves more than a passing mention, but it deserves also to be placed in the context of what it actually represented for the medical understanding of the time. A catastrophic, total failure of every explanation and every treatment available. The physicians diagnosed it according to humoral theory, an imbalance in black bile, a corruption of the air, an unfavorable planetary conjunction. The church offered prayer, penitential processions, the intercession of saints. None of it worked. Nothing worked. The plague did not respond to bloodletting, to herbs, to prayer, to flagellation, to burning the houses of the dead. It moved through communities with indifferent speed, and the experience of its passage permanently altered the European understanding of the relationship between mortality, medicine, and faith. Surgery in the medieval world was the domain where suffering became most viscerally real and most precisely documented. The absence of modern anesthesia meant that any operation performed on a conscious patient was a test of human endurance that we find genuinely difficult to imagine from the safe distance of our time. Arrow wounds were among the most common surgical emergencies in a world where warfare was conducted with bows. The arrow might need to be extracted from deep within a wound, and the tools available, iron hooks, probes, forceps, required both skill and speed, since prolonged manipulation of a wound increased the risk of overwhelming shock. The wound would be cleaned with wine, which, being alcoholic, had some genuine antiseptic effect, or with a mixture of herbs. It would be packed with linen soaked in wine or oil and allowed to drain before being closed. Amputation, when necessary, was a procedure of terrifying directness. The patient might be given as much alcohol as could be consumed to dull their awareness, a crude but partially effective preparation. Some medieval surgical texts mention opium-based preparations, mixtures of poppy, hemlock, and other narcotics that could induce something approaching unconsciousness, though the dosage was imprecise enough to be dangerous in itself. Then the saw, the knife, the cauterizing iron heated in the fire, the rush of all possible speed to complete the procedure before shock became fatal. Medieval surgeons who worked on battle wounds developed genuine expertise in this procedure. Some of them, particularly those attached to military campaigns, performed it hundreds of times and developed techniques that, while primitive by modern standards, were effective enough that patients survived and recovered. Trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, was practiced in the medieval period, sometimes to relieve pressure from head injuries, and skulls have been found that show evidence of this surgery, followed by bone regrowth, meaning the patient survived. The bone regrew. The person walked away or was carried away and lived on. For women in the medieval world, childbirth was a surgery that came without preparation, without professional distance, without any guarantee of outcome. It was the event that most clearly concentrated all the risks of medieval medicine into a single irreducible crisis. Estimates of maternal mortality in the medieval and early modern periods range widely, but some historical analyses suggest that between 1 in 20 and 1 in 5 women died as a direct result of childbirth or its complications. And since most women bore 5, 6, or more children, the cumulative lifetime risk was sobering. Birth was overwhelmingly a female domain. Male physicians rarely entered the birthing room, both because of cultural prohibitions and because the obstetrical knowledge in Latin medical texts bore a limited relationship to what actually helped in the hours of labor. Midwives learned their craft through apprenticeship and experience, accumulating detailed practical knowledge about positioning, breathing, when to encourage and when to intervene. They knew how to turn a baby presenting in the wrong position. They knew which herbs, fennel, pennyroyal, certain preparations of ergot in carefully controlled doses could encourage uterine contractions. They knew how to apply pressure. They knew how to speak to a frightened woman in the small hours of the night and give her what she needed most, the certainty that she was not alone. When things went wrong, prolonged labor, postpartum hemorrhage, childbed fever, which we now know was caused by bacterial infection introduced through unwashed hands and instruments, there was relatively little that could be done. Childbed fever would kill far more women throughout history than medieval practitioners could account for, and it would continue to do so until the 19th century, when a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis made the devastating discovery that it was doctors themselves, moving between the morgue and the delivery room without washing their hands, who were carrying the infection. The medieval midwife who never went near a morgue and whose hands, while not sterile, were at least free of cadaver contamination, may inadvertently have been safer in this one respect than the learned hospital physician. Childbirth was accompanied by the full spiritual apparatus of the medieval world. Women prayed to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of pregnant women, a saint whose legend involved being swallowed by a dragon and emerging unharmed, an image that offered obvious symbolism for the passage of a child through the body. Sacred relics, if they could be obtained, were placed near the laboring woman. Prayer rolls were wrapped around the belly. Amulets and pieces of amber were pressed into the mother's hands. Some of these practices were officially sanctioned by the church. Others existed in the older, less easily categorized territory of folk belief, but their function was consistent: to give the woman something to hold on to when the biological reality of what was happening gave her no reliable certainty of outcome. The everyday illnesses of medieval life, the ones that were neither dramatic enough for the surgeon nor severe enough for the hospital, were handled with a practicality that is genuinely impressive when you look at it closely. Toothache, which was extraordinarily common in a population that ate a diet high in grain starches and had no fluoride in their water and no regular dental care, was treated in multiple ways. Oil of cloves, which contains eugenol, a natural analgesic that is still used in dental preparations today, was applied directly to the tooth and surrounding tissue. Garlic and mallow were pressed against the gum. And if none of this worked, the barber-surgeon was called to extract the offending tooth with his forceps, bracing the patient against the chair and pulling with the steady, practiced force of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Digestive complaints were treated with fennel, peppermint, ginger, and chamomile teas, remedies that remain in use for exactly the same purpose today. Headaches were addressed with preparations of lavender, rose, and sage, applied as washes or inhaled in steam. Broken bones were set and splinted, and archaeological evidence consistently shows that many healed correctly, which means that the people setting them knew what they were doing. Skin infections were treated with honey and herb poultices. Respiratory infections, colds, bronchitis, early pneumonia were treated with steam inhalations, chest poultices, and broth, all of which provide genuine symptomatic relief, even if they cannot address the underlying infection. One of the most persistent and unfair misconceptions about the medieval period is the idea that people were uniformly, comprehensively dirty. The image of the unwashed medieval peasant, living in filth and knowing no better, is a product of later centuries' self-flattery more than of historical truth. Medieval people cared about cleanliness. They bathed, not in the daily shower sense of modern hygiene, but with regularity that varied enormously by social class, access to water, and season. Public bathhouses operated in medieval towns across Europe, and they were not fringe establishments. They were popular, well-patronized institutions that offered washing facilities to those who didn't have the means for a private tub. Monasteries maintained bathhouses for their communities. Wealthy households had bathing equipment. The 9th century English King Athelstan reportedly required noblemen to wash their hands before meals. Medieval medical texts recommended regular bathing as part of maintaining health, and the great Islamic medical tradition particularly emphasized cleanliness in ways that influenced European practice through translation. The famous saying attributed to Saint Hildegard, "How can a man die who has sage in his garden?" was embedded in a tradition of medical self-care that took physical maintenance seriously. What medieval people lacked was not the desire for cleanliness, but the germ theory that would have explained exactly why cleanliness mattered so much beyond the cosmetic. They knew that filth was associated with illness. They made the connection through observation. They didn't know the mechanism, so their cleanliness practices were inconsistent. Thorough in some areas, negligent in others, missing entirely the critical importance of hand hygiene in clinical settings. No account of medieval medicine would be complete without dwelling on the role of religion. Because in the medieval world, religion was not a supplement to medicine. It was a dimension of medicine as integral to the healer's practice as any herb or instrument. When you were sick in the year 1025, you did not choose between praying and seeking physical treatment. You did both. They were not in opposition. They were expressions of the same truth. That illness happened in a whole person, body and soul together, and that caring for a sick person meant attending to both. The saints were invoked with specificity. Different saints were understood to have different areas of patronage. Saint Sebastian for plague, Saint Blaise for throat ailments, Saint Lucy for eye diseases, Saint Apollonia for toothache. Prayers were addressed to them directly, through the mediation of the church or in private devotion. Pilgrimage to the shrine of a healing saint was not merely an act of piety. It was understood as a practical medical intervention. The sick traveled, sometimes enormous distances, to reach the relics of saints associated with their condition, because the power of the saint, concentrated in the physical remains of their body or the objects they had touched, was believed to be capable of working cure. Sacred water from holy wells and springs was collected and used both internally and externally. These wells were often ancient, predating Christianity and folded into Christian practice over centuries. And many of them did in fact have unusual mineral compositions. Iron-rich, sulfurous, cold and clean in a way that differentiated them from the contaminated surface water that surrounded most medieval settlements. The healing attributed to them may have had some genuine basis in the minerals they contained, filtered through a framework of spiritual explanation that was entirely sincere. The practice of incubation sleeping in a sacred space, particularly at the shrine of a saint, in the hope that the saint would appear in a dream and reveal the cure for your illness, draws directly from ancient Greek and Roman practice, absorbed into Christianity and maintained throughout the medieval period. Dream healing, the use of prayer and sacred space to access knowledge about illness through the symbolic language of sleep, is one of those medieval practices that, seen from a certain angle, looks remarkably like what modern medicine would call the therapeutic relationship, the healing power of attention, of belief, of being seen and held by a force that means you well. How many people actually survived illness in the medieval world? This is a question that deserves a more nuanced answer than the usual assumptions about medieval mortality might suggest. The reality is complex and interesting. For most ordinary illnesses, the common cold, a minor infection, a digestive ailment, a sprained joint, a clean fracture, survival rates were probably reasonably good, for reasons that have as much to do with the body's own resilience as with any medical treatment. The human immune system, unchallenged by antibiotics and therefore not subject to the bacterial resistance problems that complicate modern medicine, was highly experienced with the pathogens it regularly encountered. People who survived childhood illnesses carried robust immunity. The herbs administered provided genuine symptomatic relief. Rest, warmth, nutrition, and the attentive care of family and community. These are not trivial. They are the foundation of recovery. And medieval people provided them with a devotion born of knowing exactly what was at stake. The hard truth, though, is that infections that would be trivially treated today were killers in the medieval world. A septic wound, an infection that entered the bloodstream, was frequently fatal. Pneumonia, in a person who was already weakened by poor nutrition or a previous illness, often progressed to a point where the body could not recover. Childbirth infections, as already noted, claimed enormous numbers of women in their reproductive years. Childhood mortality in general was staggering by modern standards. Estimates suggest that something like a third of all children born in medieval Europe did not survive to their 5th birthday, primarily from infectious diseases. Life expectancy at birth was low, but this reflects overwhelmingly the weight of childhood mortality. Adults who survived their early years might live to 60, 70, or beyond, ages that medieval people themselves did not find remarkable. The truth about medieval survival is that the body was the hero more often than the medicine. The herbs helped sometimes, the bloodletting hurt more often than it helped. The prayers provided comfort and meaning that had genuine psychological and perhaps physiological effects through mechanisms we're only beginning to understand. And the people who sat through the night beside the sick, keeping the fire burning, pressing warm broth to cold lips, speaking quietly in the dark, provided something that medicine in any era has been slow to adequately measure, but that every sick person recognizes immediately. The healing that comes from not being left alone. And now, let the night settle around you. Let the room grow a little quieter. Let the year 1025 drift back into the edges of your awareness like smoke from a fire that burned long ago, still faintly present, still warm. Picture the stone house one more time. Outside, the winter is absolute, the kind of cold that crystallizes sound, that makes the stars brittle and sharp above the frost-stiffened field. Inside, the candle by the sickbed burns small but steady. The sick person's breathing has changed slightly in the last hour. It has slowed a little, deepened, the tight and labored quality easing into something quieter. The fever is still there, but it has stopped climbing. The family notices. They don't say anything. They don't need to. The woman who has been sitting at the bedside for most of the night reaches over and lays the back of her hand against the sick person's forehead. The gesture as old as human care itself. The first thermometer, the most ancient instrument of medicine. She lifts her eyes and looks across the room at her husband, or her mother, or her daughter, and the look between them carries everything that words don't need to say. Not better yet, but not worse either. Still here, on the small table beside the bed, a clay cup holds the cooling remains of a broth made from roots and bitter herbs. Against the wall, a bunch of dried sage hangs from a hook. Someone has murmured a prayer earlier in the evening, to which saint, exactly, no longer matters. What matters is that it was meant, that the words were said with the whole self, with nothing held back, that someone stood in the dark of their own fear and addressed whatever force seemed most likely to be listening, and asked, as clearly as they could, for one more morning, for the person in this bed to still be breathing when the light came back. For most people living 1,000 years ago, sickness was not a medical problem. It was a moment when life, faith, family, and fate all met in the same small room. It was a test of everything that mattered, of knowledge, of love, of courage, of the willingness to stay. And more often than we remember, they stayed. They burned the fire down and stoked it back up. They boiled the willow bark and pressed it to dry lips. They prayed and worked and waited, and sometimes, in the way that the body sometimes simply decides to keep going. The morning came, and the person in the bed opened their eyes, and the world continued. Sleep well. You made it to morning, too. And if tonight's journey through history left you with something, curiosity, comfort, a sense of how long people have been caring for each other through the dark hours, please consider leaving a like and subscribing if you haven't already. It helps this channel reach more people who might need exactly this kind of quiet story at the end of a long day. We'll see you next time, somewhere further back in time, and just as close to home.